All right, welcome. In this session, we're going to talk about the most significant historical dramatic act in the Old Testament. It is the rescue of the children of Israel from Egypt as Moses leads them through the Red Sea, and as they find redemption in that great experience of rescue. So, that story is found in Exodus 13, 14, right through that section. And as you read the book of Exodus, and even as you consider the vast sweep of the Old Testament, and even beyond that, going into the New Testament, keep your mind open to the reality that this event of the calling of these people out of Egypt, this event is the most redemptive event. It is the event that, for all practical purposes, there would really be no further story to tell if it were not for this kind of event. The significance of this event, for example, would have the same kind of equivalence that we would think about when we think about redemption or the redemptive story in the New Testament involving Christ. You just cannot imagine that if there were no Jesus story, that there would really be any story whatsoever to tell. Or think about it possibly as the story of the birth of the church as the Holy Spirit comes and fills believers, and the movement of following Christ begins. You could not imagine there being anything in the book of Acts if it were not for Acts 2. So as we approach and as we just put in the forefront the story of the Exodus, the story of the rescue, there is simply no other story that carries the dramatic picture and reality of redemption that this particular story does. And the weight and significance of this story just flows throughout the rest of the entire sweep of Scripture. So this is what we're going to do. We're just going to take a few minutes and talk about this story as certainly the most redemptive event, but what oftentimes happens in the Bible, and something we've talked about just on several occasions, is that if we don't identify some of these really high points in the Bible where there's an intensity or the mission of God is being compelled in a very dramatic kind of a way as it is here, then we oftentimes will make the mistake of just flatline reading the Bible. Well, this is that moment. This is the story from which the other stories, whether you're coming into them, you could even go back, for example, as far as Genesis stories and creation stories, and once you can see what this redemptive story is all about, you can even begin to see that from the early days of creation and the call of Abraham and all that happened from that point forward really is driving us to this Exodus story. And then it is quite easy to see that once this story happens, once the story is told, that so much of the rest of God's redemptive story flows right out of what happens in the Exodus. So let me just encourage you, as you think about the Exodus story, to think in terms of this story as an interpretive lens or an interpretive key. In other words, you're doing a lot of interpretation throughout the Bible, or particularly, for the moment, we'll just keep it Old Testament. As you are interpreting stories all throughout the Old Testament, this moment is so determinative and it is so defining of a moment that it is one of those it is one of those historical moments that really help shape and help us to see what the intent of the rest of the story of God's mission is. So we'll illustrate that in just a moment by looking at several of the just more immediate stories that surround it. But for now, think about the Exodus as a grand interpretive story that helps guide, that helps fashion, that brings clarity, that brings insight into all other stories virtually throughout Scripture. So it's certainly no surprise that tied up in all of this story is somebody like Moses. So, having said that, let's just see if we can illustrate how it might work, and then I think you'll be able to now just go to the text and begin to read other texts beyond this in light of what we'll do right now with it. This event of the Exodus is the place where not just the historical drama of it all is a group of people in Egypt, and God is going to bring them out. He's going to make a nation out of them, and they will be his people. Certainly the drama of all of that, that God has heard their cries and he's seen their oppression, and he's going to send Moses to them. The drama that is associated with all of that is certainly at a peak level. However, it is also one of those moments in the Bible, and I can't think of anywhere else, quite honestly, in the Old Testament, where we have this convergence of incredible dramatic story. God is doing something. He's busting in on this story in a very clear, decisive type way. But what you want to keep an eye on as well is that it's not just the way that God works in this story. These stories, with all of their historical drama attached to them, these stories carry a significant amount of theological weight as well. In other words, not only are these stories high drama stories, stories that are very interesting just to tell or to hear or to listen, they are stories that are also filled with a high level of theological thinking, things that help us to understand what God is like, who God is, what God's mission is, what God's purpose is in forming a people or redeeming a people. And so this is a great confluence of the story itself and the incredible theological significance that these stories carry. So as you're reading through the stories in Exodus, let me encourage you to think about both of them, not just the historical drama, but the sheer amount of foundational theological significance that is embedded in the stories themselves. So let's just take a few of the stories and just give a really brief illustration of what this might look like. As you open the book of Exodus, one of the things that we see is that the promise, or the command rather, that God gave all the way back in the days of creation to Adam and Eve and animals as well, to be fruitful and multiply, is ongoing. Although there is a people who are in Egyptian bondage, the one thing that is told without any doubt whatsoever in the story as it opens up is that the concern of Pharaoh is that these people are in fact being fruitful, and they are multiplying. They are growing. And so although they are in an oppressive situation, and although they find themselves enslaved in Egypt, the original promise from Genesis has found a root in this story, and Pharaoh kind of looks out. And the one thing that strikes him is that no matter what he seems to do, and even though they're oppressed, and even if he raises the workload, under all of these conditions and under all of these circumstances, the people are fruitful and they multiply. And so this just heightens Pharaoh's concern. His concern is going to be that they could partner up with the enemy nation of Egypt, join them, and overtake Egypt. So this is just one easy way that you see from the very opening page of Exodus how the theological significance, or how the mandate to be fruitful and multiply surfaces in the story of these people who find themselves enslaved. So here are some of the things I want you just to kind of, these are well-known stories. The temptation as you read through the stories involving, most of these, involving Moses at some point, the temptation is to think that Moses is the central figure, or that he is the heroic figure of these stories. Keep in mind that as significant as Moses is, the central figure in the story is not Moses, it is God. It is what God does through Moses. So let's just look at some of these things. Look at the event itself, the story that you're going to be familiar with, and just take a really brief look at a theological aspect, or something theological that grows out of that story, in which we can kind of see how this thing of dramatic story and foundational theology just come together in this redemptive moment. One itself is certainly the birth of Moses. Because Pharaoh is so very concerned about the population growth of the Israelites, he commands that the baby boys be killed as they are delivered. And undoubtedly, the story of Moses, where he is born of all things, Pharaoh's own daughter finds him after Moses is born. He's placed in a basket. Pharaoh's daughter discovers him. You just can't, make this kind of a story up. What you see in this story is certainly the drama of, here's one Hebrew boy that has a chance at survival against the mandate of Pharaoh, and of all things, his redemption or his salvation or his survival rests in the hands of Pharaoh's own daughter. So the story is certainly filled with a high level of intensity as far as the drama, as far as the fact that here's this little baby boy in a basket. He's placed in the water, and Pharaoh's daughter discovers him, and she is willing to give him back to his mother to be weaned, and then take him to be responsible for raising him, and so forth. It is an amazing thing to see the theological side of this, in that you see the providence of God. The story itself is very moving, is very challenging, is very powerful. At the same time, what you see in this story theologically is the providence of God, and how powerful it is, and how present it is, and how in such an uncanny kind of way Moses kind of slips through the fingers of Pharaoh himself, and is actually being ultimately going to be raised right in Egypt. So you have that kind of a story, and then of course Moses will try to do a redemptive act on his own when he sees a Hebrew being beaten by an Egyptian, and Moses gets in there and he kills the Egyptian and buries him in the sand, thinking that perhaps in some way this is some effort to be redemptive for the Hebrews. All of that kind of turns against him. Pharaoh wants to kill him, of course, when he finds out about it. So Moses makes his way into the wilderness, and after 40 years in the wilderness, he has this experience at a bush. The bush is burning, which in of itself is probably not the miracle of it all. It was common in that day, in the dry and arid land in which he was, and the brittleness of the bush. Sometimes there would just be kind of a spontaneous outburst of fire or flame. And as incredible as that is, the real incredible thing about this experience is that that bush becomes the place where Moses encounters. He has an experience with God. There is the revelation of God, and Moses is going to receive his call. He's going to, in a sense, he's going to step into the experience or into the very presence of God. God is going to reveal himself as Yahweh, a name that can be variously translated, a word that is actually a verb that could mean I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And however that is actually translated, what happens in this revelation between God and Moses is that Yahweh is revealed to Moses in such a way that he is bigger than the story itself can hold. That is, Yahweh is bigger than that. And there's just not a name that can, in a sense, can contain who Yahweh is and what he is about. So Moses is having this encounter with Yahweh, who is revealing himself, and he is calling Moses. And this moment at the burning bush, as you can imagine, as you can already see, again, is filled not only with the high drama of here is a God all of a sudden encountering Moses, or Moses is encountering God. It is filled with a lot of theological significance. And certainly one of the great significances theologically is the whole idea that Yahweh is going to reveal himself to Moses. Moses is called to go back to Pharaoh, to go back down to Egypt, where he will be the instrument of God in delivering the Israelites out of Egypt. When he goes back down there, he's going to encounter Pharaoh. And in that encounter, Moses is going to ask Pharaoh to let the people go so they could go and worship. And Pharaoh is going to waffle on this several times, but ultimately he's going to decline on the offer of Moses to do that. So what happens is that when Moses goes, there will be, as you know, a series of plagues, beginning with the water turning to blood. And then there will be subsequent plagues that involve things like boils and gnats and flies and frogs and so forth. But they will culminate in the last two plagues, which will be a darkness will cover the land, and the plague of the firstborn son being killed as the death angel comes over. So as Moses is going down to Egypt and he is encountering Pharaoh, again, it would be very easy to think that these are stories that are indicative of the heroic status of Moses. To whatever degree, certainly that might be true. The theological significance and actually the historical drama of the story is that it is not so much what plays out on the historical plane between Pharaoh and Moses, although that is certainly significant. What is happening is that each of these stories, or each of these individuals, Pharaoh on the one hand, Moses on the other, are in a sense representatives, ambassadors, voice pieces for the gods that they represent. So Moses has one God. That was part of the revelation, that there's just one God, is Yahweh. The Egyptians have many gods. So every time there is a plague on the Egyptians, it is really a theological contest between Yahweh and whatever particular Egyptian god that is at stake. For example, again, the Nile River, the god of the Nile. Could you imagine what would happen in a place like Egypt if their water source, something as significant as the Nile, is contaminated? It could certainly lead to the very ruin and the fall of the nation itself. So here we have a place where Yahweh, in a sense, takes on and defeats the god of the Nile. And the same thing is true with all of the other plagues. This one Yahweh of Moses is able to face and contend triumphantly against any of the gods of the Egyptians. And as the plagues begin to bear out with intensity and consequence, when they come down to the last two plagues, we begin to see that these plagues are dramatic, not only because they impact the livelihood of the Egyptians, now they are about to impact the very life of the Egyptians themselves, as they come right to the firstborn of the families or of the livestock and the cattle, who will be killed or who will be destroyed as the death angel comes against them. And only the Israelites, with the taking the the blood of a slain lamb and putting it on their doorpost, hence the Passover, as the death angel passes over. But you can see how theologically intense all of this story is. For God is theologically and historically, God is the triumphant God. He is the Yahweh who now triumphs over any potential contender, regardless of who that might be. So, in a sense, this is not just about a contest between Moses and Pharaoh. It is ultimately about the one Yahweh that has called Moses and the many gods of the Egyptians. The irony of this story is that it was just earlier in the book of Exodus where Pharaoh was mandating the death of the baby boys of the Hebrews, and now this whole story has been turned against him, where it will be his firstborn son or the firstborn sons of the Egyptians and cattle and livestock. So as you're reading these stories, you are familiar with the historical drama of the story. Start thinking in terms theologically of how significant these stories are theologically. And now also start looking for moments when you have this kind of story where Pharaoh has made an initial command concerning the Hebrew sons, and now it is his own son, the people have the sons of his own people whose lives are endangered. Just look at the sheer irony of how this story has come all the way back around now to be a story that is going to be to the detriment of Pharaoh and the people of his entire nation. So I've mentioned the Passover. This is a moment in which theologically think about the significance of election, a word that kind of draws people to conclusions at different places, but for the moment, all that just put all that aside if you can. Just look at it theologically here. as God choosing Moses, which is election, having already in Genesis chosen Abraham in election, and now God is going to choose a nation or take these people out of bondage and create out of them a nation. All of that is election. Election will ultimately be wrapped up around mission. That is, God has a redemptive mission. His redemptive mission is to bless the world. His redemptive mission is for the world to be able to see His glory. And one of the beautiful and enriching insights of how God works through election is seen right here, in that as God selects or elects people like Abraham and Moses and the nation of Israel, that God's interest is for the entire world, is for all of the nations of the world. But in order for Him to be revealed to the nations of the world, He elects, in the case of Abraham or Moses, He might elect a person or a nation. And so here we begin to see some of the beautiful and powerful theological significance of what election is all about, what its intention is designed to be. And it's the intention of election is for God to be known, for His glory to be known by all people throughout the world. These are also the stories in which, as the people prepare to leave, they have celebrated the Passover, they're going to the Red Sea, where the Exodus event is going to happen. These stories also reveal that God is going to move with the people. There will be a cloud by day and fire by night, and in this sense, we begin to see not only the historical drama of the presence of God with His people, we also begin to see theologically that this is a God who will move with His people, and He will protect His people. He will be with His people, and whether it is day, whether it is night, He is among or amidst His people. He is the God who certainly opens the Red Sea as the people march along or march across on dry land, and they safely arrive on the other side. And then as Pharaoh's chariots and armies begin to enter into the waters, collapse on them, and they are drowned in the waters. So we begin to see the significance theologically of the presence of God in the context of the sheer drama of this event of the Exodus, the rescue or the redemption of God's people. So next time we're going to be talking about what happens with the people when they come and God reveals 10 words of life to them. For the moment, this session, if just one thing that kind of you can gravitate to and you can just hold on to, and that will help guide you in reading the entire story of redemption anywhere in the Bible, is this: the Exodus, God leading His people through the Red Sea and saving His people and calling His people and forming a nation out of that people. That incredible redemptive event becomes the lens, becomes the way, becomes an interpretive lens through which we see the great and vast story of God. So that alone would be a great place for you just to spend some time reflecting, and then if you can just put that on the front side of your own interpretive lens, whenever you're reading the Bible, Old Testament or New Testament, you will never be far away from the Exodus. It is always there. And no matter where you go, there's going to be something in that text or in that portion of the Bible that calls you back to this grand event. So I hope that that will help frame and guide some of your reading, understanding, and insight as you are reading through the story of God's redemption.